saying Ralph K. Johnson, that's his actual name, the K stands for Kennedy, he's called Ken for short, employed by Grumman from dates to dates. Mr. Johnson's responsibilities included liaison between NASA and the MSFC Flight Crew Support Division, training astronauts. It goes through all of the things that he worked on with the crews in terms of actually teaching them how to operate this incredibly new kind of vehicle that had never been built before and had unusual characteristics. This is his actual log. These are photostats from his flight log, presented to consultant pilot Ken Johnston from Grumman. This is a photograph of Ken. Remember some of the people who keep claiming, oh, we never went to the moon because the spacesuits wouldn't fit through the door? This is Ken actually in a spacesuit working procedures for moving the astronauts from inside the lunar module to outside on the porch and then down to the lunar surface, wearing, you know, helmet and pressure suit and all that. This is more pages from the log showing specifics of various system tests and times and who was involved and signed off by supervisors and all that. And then this is the cover of his spacecraft pilot's log from Grumman. He worked both at Bethpage for a while as well as in, I forget the name of the building, I think it's Building 9 in Houston at the Manned Spacecraft Center. And ultimately he wound up getting a certificate from Grumman for the 3,000 hours that he spent in the lunar module teaching Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin and Gene Cernan and you know, Harrison Schmitt and Alan Shepard and all of the astronauts, all of the crews, what it was to fly the lunar module. And Oberg had the audacity to question this man's credentials for one purpose, only to get him eliminated from the current NASA scene. This is actually LTA 8, the Lunar Test Article 8, which was used in the vacuum chamber to use, you know, they would basically take out all the air, run it in a vacuum, everybody's in suits, and they went through the procedures. This is Jim Irwin, and I don't know who the other guy is, but this was an astronaut who was on Apollo 15, Jim Irwin, who was there with, oh, I forget his name, but it was an amazing mission to the Hadley Rill in the Apennines. And as soon as we finish this, I'll remember his commander's name. It's getting late. Say again? Dave Scott. Dave Scott. Thank you. Okay. This is now an aerial view showing that Ken actually had an office up here. This is the main building. This is where the astronauts actually had their office. The Lunar Receiving Laboratory we're going to talk about is way back on this side. This is Clear Lake. This is a more modern aerial view of the Manned Spacecraft Center, which was changed to the Johnson Spacecraft Center after Lyndon Johnson became president. This is actually a history of the Lunar Receiving Laboratory, which talks about how it was set up, its mission. It was designed to basically receive all the samples and the rocks. It was located over here. This is the actual Lunar Receiving Laboratory, and as you can see from this schematic, all the samples, all the photographs, all of the data, everything the astronauts took or brought back from the moon wound up in the LRL. Why is that important? Here is an actual photograph of the Apollo 11 lunar samples being brought into the Lunar Receiving Laboratory. Here's NASA security standing there looking very bored. All right, this is a letter now from the project manager of Brown and Root. It's not just this administration which outsources government work. NASA's been doing outsourcing to private industry for decades. And so they hired Brown and Root and Northrop Corporation, which is a big aerospace, conglomerate, and they basically gave them the contract to manage the Lunar Receiving Laboratory. And so Ken worked for, technically, not NASA, but technically for the prime contractor for the Lunar Receiving Laboratory operations under NASA, which, as you know now, that we have more private security personnel in Iraq than there are military personnel, who are also part of the occupational force and part of the war and all that. So it's kind of hard to tell. And the reason that's interesting is because the private guys have different criteria of plausible deniability than the government guys. And that is part of how you keep certain things hidden and from public view. Anyway, this is a letter from the project manager who was in charge of the LRL under this contract to, Brian Erb, who was the manager, to a Mr. Cleggett, who was a project manager for Brown and Root, reporting up the chain, saying on behalf of Mrs. Dorothy Phelan and Dr. Jeffrey Warner, he was the previous director of the LRL photo program, he'd like to commend Ralph Johnston for his performance in the lunar data and photo area. Mr. Johnston was assigned to this position in response to action item memo so-and-so and so on January 20th, 1970, and has rapidly phased into this very complex operation formally administered by Dr. Warner. Then we go on here. Here's another memorandum on December 22nd, 1971. Quality of black and white photos. Ken came up with a way to save NASA and Apollo an awful lot of money, so they didn't have to take black and white photos. They could make black and white photos for the press from the color photos, and there was no difference in quality. So this again attests to kind of day-to-day operations. This is now from Jeffrey Warner, who was the previous guy who managed the data and the photographs and was responsible for sending samples to scientists all over the world, taking photographs from the original archives, making copies, sending them to scientists all over the world. He says he's completed a thorough review and inspection of the data and photo facilities run by Ken Johnston. He finds that it is in very good shape. It is an order of magnitude better than when I left it, he says. Now, when does a PhD scientist turn to the guy who only has a BS degree and say that he's done a better job than he's done? I mean, this is a very interesting political thing because it means this guy's A, honest, and B, he understood that Ken was doing yeoman service and actually improving the entire system. And, you know, this is written just before Apollo 14, which you'll see is kind of important. Then we've got a letter from NASA from Patrick Butler, who was the associate curator of lunar samples. Dear Ken, because I know of the large part you played in the enormous task of producing the Apollo 15 and 16 lunar sample catalog, I wish to express appreciation on behalf of all the scientific investigators of lunar samples who find the catalogs indispensable. I include myself in this group. Again, for people to attack Ken's credentials on the crucial point, which is he was the guy, the go-to guy who sat on this priceless archive. So his story of what he was instructed to do with this archive has to be carefully paid attention to. All those naysayers, all those skeptics, all those detractors, all those enemies of this truth fall flat on their face because they don't have any documentation of their wacko claims. And we've got the records that Ken Johnston is exactly who he says he is, and he did exactly what he was told to do with extraordinary implications and results 40 years later. Ken went on, by the way, after Apollo closed down and he was fired along with all the other people, you know, who were working for private contractors. He went into private industry, he went back to NASA. Ultimately, he wound up working on the shuttle program, which is represented by the Enterprise, standing here on the pad in California, up the street here at Vandenberg. And he applied to be an astronaut, an actual flight astronaut, in the shuttle program. Now, I found out something so amazing the other night that I've got to share it with you because it goes into that eerie realm of what I term hyperdimensional resonance. David, are you here? David Wilcock? Did David make it back? Oh, of course.